The original Super Mario Bros. On the Nintendo Entertainment System launched with the console itself and was the first spark of recovery from the video game crash of the 1980s. And for many people, Mario is the definitive platforming powerhouse. Nintendo's main competitor Sega would follow suit quickly behind with a character whose inspiration, if we can even call it that, is very clearly meant to reference Mario. His gameplay is a little different, but it's safe to say that these two characters set a precedence for platform design as well as serving the role of lead mascots for gaming culture. In a few years' time, and with approval from Nintendo, Rare would create a new platforming experience using the titled character from Nintendo's earlier arcades. It would feature never-before-seen graphics, a brand new look for the lead character, and a new design philosophy that merged both the secrets of Mario and the momentum building of Sonic. The game I'm talking about is, of course, Donkey Kong Country. It was a smash hit, becoming the third best-selling Super Nintendo game. But what you might not know is that in 6th place was the sequel, Donkey Kong Country 2: Diddy's Kong Quest, right above Zelda: A Link to the Past. Let that sink in a moment. DKC2 outsold the mainline Zelda game, which launched far earlier in the console's lifespan. Depending on which regions you want to count, Link to the Past had about a 4-year head start, and DKC2 had only 1 year before the launch of the Nintendo 64. Needless to say, platformers were king in their heyday, and Donkey Kong was the king of cling. While the first entry had a recognizable character in the lead role and a fresh experience on offer, it's surprising that the sequel, which did not feature the main monkey on the cover and came out on the cusp of a new console generation, still managed to get within striking range of the first entry. I'm sure DKC2 has the first entry to thank for a hefty chunk of its sales, but in the age before the internet, I would wager to guess a large part of its sales figures comes from the fact that the game was very well received. Word of mouth and game rentals can do wonders for you if your quality is up to snuff, and DKC2 is now often cited as not only the best of the Donkey Kong Country trilogy, but a crowning example of polish in an otherwise oversaturated genre. After the wet fart that was DKC3, it took more than a decade before the release of Donkey Kong Country Returns, and by then the gaming landscape was no longer recognizable. Platformers have become a niche genre, yet Nintendo held a strong market presence such that the potential for success always existed within their intellectual properties. After the release of Returns, retrostudios, the new creative team taking over from Rare, was given the option of a couple of different games to pursue, and they chose to revisit the countryside to make a more complete vision of what they wanted to achieve with Returns. They had unfinished business to attend to with the series. And so today I thought it would be interesting to put Donkey Kong Country 2 in direct comparative critique with Tropical Freeze. Why am I comparing the second entries in each series and not the first? Well, I have a few reasons. The first is that the second entry is when both Rare and Retro Studios were in a position to make a fully realized vision come to life. When you're building a game from scratch, a lot of work is allocated to trying things out and hoping for the best. Once you have that project finalized, the second project provides interesting growth opportunities. Both teams can put their best foot forward, so to speak, so we're comparing a more cohesive and intentional execution. The second reason is simply that I am more familiar with these two games in particular. I have played all of them, but these are the two that I have extensive familiarity with. And I think that as we go through this, you'll find it pretty easy to swap different entries in and out as they do or do not apply to a given point. Oh, and I'm not going to be spending $60 to replay Returns. I played it once on Wii, it was fine, and like DKC3, that's all I really cared to say about them for this video. There is plenty to be said about the entire series, and I will refer to other entries on occasion, especially the first Donkey Kong Country, because it does represent the linchpin of the Country saga. But aside from that, I present to you a comparative analysis of Diddy's Kong Quest and Tropical Freeze. One thing that's perhaps inarguable is that Tropical Freeze has a more attention-getting opening with the inclusion of a short cutscene. The scenario shows the Kong celebrating a birthday, complete with a banana cake, when suddenly tragedy strikes in the form of the Snowmads, a Viking-themed assortment of animals who frost over DK Island through the use of a magic horn. They kick the Kongs out and set up shop. This all just sets the stage nicely and gives the game an exciting introduction for players. DKC2, on the other hand, just kind of starts. No frills. In the first stage, you can read K. Rool's note for the context of the story, and like many games at the time, they often used instruction booklets to do some of that heavy lifting for them. It's not a bad opening, but it does leave something to be desired. And it's the kind of change modern games excel in. A cutscene isn't a deal breaker, but I think it's good to set the tone and general vibe of the game off strong. And if the cutscene is skippable for those who don't care or have already played it before, then all the better. The end of the cutscene takes us right into the opening of the first stage, and this is just a great way to infuse the opening of the game with a ton of enthusiasm and seamlessly connect the players with the larger vision. Make no mistake, Retro Studios knows what they're doing, especially when it comes to level design. I remember Tropical Freeze getting some positive discourse back when it came out, but since it released on the Wii U, a notoriously poor-selling console, part of that discourse was about the unfortunate reality of how few had actually played it. I know some people have an issue with ports, but if there's one console library that was deserving of the treatment, it was undoubtedly the Wii U. All this to say, Tropical Freeze didn't get much fanfare when it was ported to the Nintendo Switch, and it being more expensive than its Wii U launch price didn't help matters. Regardless, it's a great platformer worthy of reappraisal. I know I sometimes come across as pretty harsh with my critiques, but something I hope people recognize is that I don't make videos often, and I definitely don't make them about games I care nothing about. I only choose ones for which I feel I can add something valuable to the conversation, as well as games that instill some passion in me, whether it be positive or negative. And Tropical Freeze instills both. And I wanted to lay that out because it's objectively wrong to say that the game is poorly designed, especially when it comes to its level design. To that end, let's break down a few moments that explain what I mean. So you play as Donkey Kong in this entry, but you're able to carry one other Kong on your back for added health and an additional ability. There are 3 Kongs to choose from, Diddy, Dixie, and Cranky, and if you start up a new game, you'll notice that only Diddy is available in the first stage, followed by Dixie in the second, and Cranky in the third. Then we have an obligatory minecart stage, and finally the boss. This gives the player a single stage to really absorb the unique mechanics of each bonus Kong. Even if they are doing poorly, there are barrel refreshes to ensure they get to mess around with things for a good while. If we take a step back and examine the map, we see that we have to beat 2 stages before we get access to Funky Kong's shop and the potential to unlock the secret stage in the world. Now, I'm not a fan of tutorial prompts, but while they are present in these early stages, they're about as unobtrusive as can be, and they don't stop the game in its tracks. The first stage alone is a perfect welcome mat. It opens with the Kongs smashing their way out of a crashed plane. Retro Studios mentioned that part of their dissatisfaction with Returns was the absence of underwater levels. Given that, I can't help but feel their elation in having the player go down a water slide into a pool at the very opening. I mean, talk about a splashy way to begin. That was terrible, I apologize. There is a hidden collectible behind this plane debris underwater. You will only find it if you backtrack, but if not, it will make for a perfect reward when the player finishes the stage and sees that the game is keeping track of your collectibles. There is only one very weak enemy, and there is a diver helm which produces air bubbles, so this space is populated just enough so that the danger is at an all-time minimum, but not non-existent, and the player has plenty of room to give swimming a try. After our first dip, we hop out and encounter our first land enemy. Then we get 2 more walking under some platforms we need to jump on. It's natural to bounce off one or both, and we can learn to use enemies to give ourselves a boost this way, but we also just don't need them to progress. Then we are immediately told to use DK's hand slap ability to destroy boulders, one of which drops us into this secret room, subconsciously showing the player how future secrets might conceal themselves. This is especially true when we see the sand fade away, rewriting the visual scene just as it happened with the aforementioned puzzle piece. Then we get 2 platforms that move with a colorful object of interest catching our eye. One of them is attached to an enemy, and the other is rewarding a puzzle for recognizing they can jump on all sorts of things. I also like the cricket enemies. Everything in this space is teaching the player to jump and jump often. Then we have to learn to pluck items up from the ground, and a second and a third time just to make sure that it really sinks in for the player. And what do you get for performing all 3? Another puzzle piece. And finally, this next section showcases the environment's instability, which teaches us to learn to react to our ever-changing circumstances. And like the opening swim, it's an exciting way to keep the player stimulated. And I love this breakable block under the piranha plant. This is a textbook example of what this game does so well. It introduces mechanics separately in relatively safe environments, and then it layers them together. And for the low price of being intuitive, you get another puzzle piece. Also, you can repeat the lesson we just learned about going on top of the piranha platforms for another puzzle piece. Before, we could see the fauna and we were drawn to it visually. Now we're expected to take a leap of faith. This gradual teaching of the player persists throughout the world and, indeed, the entire game. In the minecart level, for example, near the very beginning, there is a series of bananas going in an arc, prompting the player to jump into them. Then, immediately after this, we see the same set of bananas, only this time there is an enemy. So now you have to jump. Before both of those, you will jump automatically because the tracks are broken. You won't die if you do nothing, but you will always jump. This is level design that very gently shows the player the ropes without making them feel like they're not ready to play yet. In Windmill Hills, the gimmick is to jump on platforms rotating in conjunction with the spinning windmills. Then you go inside of one, climb up it, and blast out to then do a short barrel blast sequence where the windmills rotate to offer different rewards based on timing. Some windmills spin slowly, others quickly, some have enemies, some don't. Some have hidden puzzle pieces, others have platforms that disappear shortly after standing on them. The idea of a platforming windmill stage is executed to the absolute fullest, and then, in true Donkey Kong Country fashion, the game is perfectly content to just move on, abandoning many of these mechanics for ideas that exist on the other side of the hill. And they're even thematic as well. Take Alpine Incline, for example. We begin in the foreground, hopping along these planks elevated with ropes. Then we launch ourselves to the background where the planks are now elevated by hot air balloons. Then we replace the platforms with bouncing owl heads and vines dangling from balloons before we launch even further into the background and blast our way into the sky. The music takes on a new identity, and we spend the rest of the stage bouncing on balloons and doing our best to avoid falling out of the sky or getting hit by flying penguin pilots. I mean, just look at the transitions in this stage. So much exhilaration propelling us around the countryside. All of what I'm saying also applies to the world maps as well. Take a tour of the savannas with me for a moment. We begin with a festival-themed celebration to kick things into high gear. Then we have a rocky mountain landscape before it turns into a dusty tornado. On the aside, we start by interacting with small whirlwinds, and we end by launching ourselves into a giant tornado, repeating a similar structure that we saw in Windmill Hills. Then we go through a wildfire before the on-rails flying stage over a lake. This serves as a junction point between the first and second halves of the world. It opens up 3 stages, a barrel blasting joyride, a rinky-dink railing system over a canyon, and a rendition of Bramble Scramble full of prickly vines. There's a real effort to make sure what you're playing through is part of a larger narrative, even if that narrative is mostly just theme. The entirety of Juicy Jungle, for example, details the long process of making fruity popsicles for the boss. No, it's not especially deep, but it is narrative coherence. But you're not here for me to dissect all the nuances of why every level is great. You're here because I'm putting it up against its history. So let's revisit the opening stage of DKC2 and see how it compares. We begin on a pirate ship with nowhere else to go except straight. There's a drop-off and a cabin entrance which provides plot details to get us hooked. We also have a one-up balloon, a ruby red item we are instantly attracted to. Diddy himself wears red after all, and all we need to do is jump to grab it. This is the game teaching you to do just that. In fact, if you don't know how to run, it's pretty easy to get sucked into this room by accident. Then we get our first enemy, a rat who makes a loud squeaky noise which signals to us to pay attention to the imminent danger. This is another opportunity to learn how to jump, by the way, in case we miss the cabin. Once we deal with him, we can recruit Dixie Kong, and if we're feeling mischievous, we can bring her back for that classic platforming moment where you immediately go in the opposite direction and pick up a secret. Then we get a crate and a Kremlin. The Kremlin is on a series of barrels, so we don't actually have to fight him. But we can see the banana bunch above him, so we are encouraged to get into an altercation. Then we reverse positions. Enemies on the bottom floor, safety, indicated by bananas, on top, and a gap. We are learning about different elevations, different ways of dealing with enemies. And along the way, we're picking up our first collectible. Then we're confronted with a few more rats to ensure we are storing solutions to these guys in our memory banks. And we can see a banana coin we can't quite reach. Once we figure out how to toss Dixie to grab it, we now have the knowledge to get that secret from the opening. Then we have a pit of enemies. If we haven't had the confidence to jump on enemies yet, we're going to pick that up now for sure. Then there's a drop off into the ocean, but the trail of bananas has us curious. If we don't trust the bananas, we will jump over the gap and be surprised to find an enemy emerge from a barrel. He will rush us, but instead of damaging us, he will push us back into that hole where we will discover our first bonus room. This is the game teaching the player that bananas are not going to lead you astray, and that there are hidden chambers if you keep your wits about you. After the bonus stage, we'll get a sample of our first animal companion, but I think you get the idea, so let's take a look at some other examples throughout the game. The first stage in the swamp, for example, is Barrel Bayou, which presents us with the number 5 printed on a barrel. When we jump into this barrel, we will see 2 rows of bananas at an angle and the K letter above it. The only way to get everything is to rotate the barrel in the proper direction and then rinse and repeat. Until this point, we could not rotate barrels, and now we can, so it's good that designers provide this safe zone to learn a core mechanic for the stage. And I'll give you one final quick example. In Red Hot Ride, we are presented with a balloon elevated by steam from the lava pools. Once we're on it, we will realize that our movement is now tied to the balloon, so there's no chance of falling off unless we jump. We can learn this by simply following the bananas to safety. On the next balloon, there will be that familiar K letter floating just above the lava with 2 streams of hot air on both sides. This is here to bait the player into getting comfortable with alternating elevations, which they will need to complete the stage. Throughout the stage, we will go through sequences where we need to stay low and parts where we need to get as much elevation as possible to be able to sustain ourselves over a long gap. Again, every which way the thematic mechanic of the stage can be used is used. And if we zoom out, we get this same thematic linkage of Tropical Freeze. Gangplank Galleon gives us a side-scrolling tutorial stage, then a rope-climbing vertical stage, then back to form with a proper pirate stage, easing up on the tutorials and instead teaching us about hanging hooks, which is sort of a combination of the first 2 stages that we just went through. Then we dive into the hull of the ship to sample underwater gameplay, and finally back to a vertical stage up the second mast, featuring a predominant animal buddy. In other worlds, similar ideas persist. One lava stage followed by a barrel blasting mine stage, then an underwater stage with a lava twist, then back to standard lava, this time with a hot air balloon twist, then another mine, this time incorporating an animal companion. Crazy Kremlin has honey hives outside the theme park, and so on and so forth. I know I've spent quite a bit of time just breaking down the small ways the games communicate, but I wanted to stress how nuanced of a parallel the two really are. I've cherry-picked a few stages, but the same guiding hand is present to both games all over the place. It is the fundamental reason people praise Tropical Freeze, and I approve. But my analysis will go deeper than stage layouts. I think we've established that both games are masters when it comes to mechanical level design, and as these are platformers, it's an all too important topic. I just also care about a great many other topics in my Donkey Kong. I've always liked the board game layout for selecting stages, for example. The overworld may just be a level select screen, but they've always been visually nice to look at. They also can give you small hints about what you're going to face in the levels. For example, the honey hive stages in DKC2 are depicted in a honey hive. In Tropical Freeze, the tradition carries on. Unlike Country Games of the Fast, Tropical Freeze does away with a singular cohesive island and instead forces you to hop from one uniquely separated map to another. Whether they blend together logically or not is irrelevant. However, DKC2 did have a connected world, and there's something to be said for that. Crocodile Isle is a bit strange when taken together as a single structure, but each world does help forge a cohesive vision. This is an evil isle, so naturally we can find lava-filled caverns at the bottom, along with a port to the island which has since become a graveyard for ships, and the swamp vibes keep up the haunting atmosphere. Once we're in the island proper, there's the Kremlin theme park showing a mischievous side to the characters. Kremlin is also a nice mixture of bramble and swamp stages, making for a smoother transition from one world to the next. Then we have Gloomy Gulch, followed by K-Rool's Keep, all in a nice vertical ascension. The islands in Tropical Freeze function more like they do in DKC3, actually, except in that game you have a boat that takes you to each area, and that helps tie the aesthetics together. To be honest, Dixie's Double Trouble may actually be the most cohesive game because it creates a biome of similarly adjacent environments, resisting the urge to make each world a night and day disparity with one another. Tropical Freeze has you launch in a barrel, deliberately making a disconnect between each world. They want the freedom to take the island in any which direction that feels right in the moment. It isn't realistic or even thematically cohesive to launch to an island and suddenly find yourself in the hot savannas, but Tropical Freeze does gain something at the price of continuity, and that's surprises. You never know what's coming up next. Now personally, I never minded the hints, since apart from DKC1, you can't usually see the whole world map anyways. But by fracturing them apart as completely independent biomes, the game makes it clear that it believes the trade-off to be worth it. And I respect it, even if it's not my personal preference. I think I respect it because it does at least play into the theme of taking a tropical island getaway. And by that metric, each time you clear a world, it's like extending your vacation. And it's possible to argue that DKC2 doesn't have as cohesive of a world as we might want. For example, you never get to a honey hive dedicated area, but there are honey hives more or less arbitrarily placed throughout. The same can be said for many of the ice stages, and there are some stages for which there is not really an indication on the map of what you're going to get exactly. Crocodile Cauldron comes to mind in particular for having lava locations and a smattering of stages thrown about. Lava Lagoon is the only stage for which we can see a crashed ship, but the rest we have to use our imagination for. I don't think DKC2 gets a pass here, but there are two things worth keeping in mind. The first is that even though there are areas for which the world doesn't connect well, for the most part, these are rare. Gangplank Galleon, for example, has its climbing mast levels located on the masts of the ship, the deck levels on the deck, and the underwater hull level located in the hull of the ship. And a similar sentiment exists for most of the game world, so the complaint is minor. The other point has to do with what was true of the era. 8-bit systems relied on players using their imagination to fill in the gaps. That mentally persisted until, at best, the 6th generation of consoles with the Nintendo GameCube. Nowadays, the standards should be higher. There's no reason to disconnect worlds when we have the technology to connect them. Unless, of course, it is for an artistic decision. Either way, the end result is what it is, and for my preferences, DKC2's changes in environments add a refreshing change of pace, especially in the harder areas where they are more needed. In other words, I don't mind an out-of-place stage shoehorned into a world as much as I mind the separate worlds belonging to the random roll of a dice. One thing I noticed in my playthrough of DKC2 was just how much dialogue and character interaction that permeates the game. Writing isn't something we typically think of when it comes to platformers, but DKC2 is filled with interesting Kong characters, and they're bound to add humanity to your journey if you only take a moment to stop in. Cranky Kong is of course the main highlight with his "kids these days" attitude and a plethora of hints, but it doesn't stop there. You have Funky Kong, Wrinkly Kong, and Swanky Kong, each offering an original bazaar of sorts. I imagine most people skip past all of this and just play the game, which is why the design goals have shifted so much, but it is something that makes many older games special. I doubt anyone told Rare they needed to include more Kongs, but they did it because going that extra mile adds a certain amount of charm and interest. You don't need to hire Funky Kong's air ride to travel from world to world, and so it has been replaced with an interfacing that is simpler and more efficient. However, such efficiency is so minor, it hardly feels like the trade-off was worth it. One simple idea Retro could have implemented here was to showcase Funky on various vacation ventures each time we encounter him. Perhaps when we visit his kiosk in Sea Breeze Cove, we might find him putting on some scuba gear. They took the trouble to make the backgrounds match. I don't see why that was considered enough, because it's not really about whether or not we need details like that. It's about how those details add to the overall experience. The focus for Tropical Freeze is all but entirely about the gameplay, so I suppose it's more fair to keep the conversation centered around that as much as possible. So to that end, I'd like to draw our attention back to Funky Kong and the mechanical way in which he was implemented in the previous title. What Funky Kong did was allow you to fly between each world, and this had an effect on the player that has since been lost over time. The potential is most illuminated in Gloomy Gulch, a harder endgame area. You have to complete nearly every stage before you get access to Funkies. This made for a compelling source of tension because the player would know they were going into enemy territory without knowing how long they'd have to survive before they are allowed to make a retreat into safer zones. Wrinkly's Kong College is also a balancing act in this. You can't save your game in a new area until you find her, which meant it was a good idea to stock up on extra lives before venturing ahead, as dying too much in a newer, much harder area meant losing progress. DKC2 isn't a hard enough game to really have this consequence land, however, yet it remains engaging because it added twists and turns to your journey. Maybe all you get access to is Swanky or Cranky Kong, so you have to make do with picking up some extra lives or advice. I do have two problems with it though. The first is that only Gloomy Gulch really takes advantage of this idea. But I suppose this isn't a fair complaint. The first area doesn't gain any benefit from having to transport since there's nothing to backtrack to, and while many of the areas make you earn the ability to backtrack, it isn't usually too long of a wait apart from the final two. Keep in mind also that your lives and banana coins reset whenever you shut the game off, meaning even if you can make it to K-Roll's Keep, if you die too much, it'll be difficult to make progress since you can't backtrack for extra lives. In the retro scene, it was common to extend the life of a game by having you replay levels. Tropical Freeze's solution to this is to make the replaying of levels something that has a unique style to it, but more on that later. It might have been interesting to have each area be an optional path after you complete Mangrove Cove. You could indicate the difficulty of each area if you want, but my question that I've been hinting at here is why have such a linear path through the game when there's clearly no aesthetic reason to do so? I mean, would it really have mattered if I did the sea area first as opposed to the savannas? The second issue I have in DKC2's execution is about how cheap Funky flights are. It's 2 coins to commission the trip, but then it's free from that venue for the rest of the game. This means that once you find Wrinkly or Funky, you can always fly back to a previous area to save and then fly back to where you were. That broke the immersion of being soaked and trapped within a place. Wrinkly herself will save your game for free, but then it's 2 coins after that for the rest of the game. These 2 costs should have been reversed. If anything is going to be free, saving your progress should be it. If you can't find Wrinkly, then pay up at Funky's if it's that important to save right now. Many a time as a kid, you have to sacrifice your progress because your mom is dragging you on errands and you can't reach a save in time. The fact that DKC2 didn't save your resources was fine because it incentivized long play sessions, incentivized seeing other Kongs, incentivized replaying stages that the player was good at to stock up on resources, and so on. In Tropical Freeze, you're showered in banana coins, but the coins aren't used to pay for anything that the player desperately needs, like saving your freaking progress. Now, I can get behind the idea of letting go of locking player progression behind an in-game paywall, but it's inarguable that the resources in Tropical Freeze mostly serve in providing incentives to make stages easier to get through. Not a bad place for them to be in, but it is different. DKC2 felt like you had to budget coins to stay alive, like paying rent, especially if you were doing one world at a time. It has more tension, and I'd be in favor of a more original punishment rather than erasing player progress, but figuring out what that is of course the question, and most games struggle to come up with an emotionally satisfying answer. Another reason you might want to revisit old areas was to hunt for those Creme coins and to practice. The larger goal of the game was to encourage the player to get good at the game, so revisiting an easier world helps provide them with a reprieve from constant difficulty spikes. And it also reminded you of the lost level stages, encouraging the player to make progress if it seems impossible on the main path. Tropical Freeze does encourage revisiting previous worlds, if for no other reason than to find all the collectibles and to get gold rank in time trial mode. You can also test your limits at the temple stages, which only unlock after all the stages in the world have been completed. The temple stages are very rough, but they grant a relic whose purpose only becomes revealed at the end. And what they unlock is 3 of the toughest stages in the game, a sort of half-lost worlds if you will, and finally the ability to play through the entire game again on hard mode. It all makes logical sense, but it isn't very emotionally compelling, is it? You're never trapped in a world fighting for your survival. That element, which did come at the player with some serious spite if you were a kid in 1995, is totally absent in Tropical Freeze. Even if it wasn't perfect in DKC2, it was nice having it there. Each individual stage is where retro studios have hedged their bets. The overworld conflicts may be faithful in presentation, but not in substance, or vice versa depending on your values. As it is, all the Kong shops have been replaced with one, Funky's Flying By. Here you can spend your coins for extra lives, more health, invincibility potions, squawks to help with item discovery, or to bring a backup Kong during a level. Having Funkies at every island is redundant but necessary. You don't want them to exist in the menus, nor do you want to have to backtrack to a previous island, but you have to admit that the contrast does illuminate the driving force of this game. If playing the levels is the main attraction, which it should be, then having Funky convenient in each world to supply the player with tools to get through the stages is the most optimal approach to satisfy that criteria. Why then do we have to complete any stages at all before we can see him? Unlocking him in a world just grants a convenience. I suppose the idea is to encourage the player to revisit previous worlds, but if I wanted to visit Funky, it's to buy something to help me with the stage I'm currently on. When I was in Seabreeze Cove, I wanted to pick up some blue balloons to refill my air meter while I was doing those underwater levels. Little did I know that Funky isn't available until the world is practically over. I didn't feel like backtracking for it because I didn't want to take the extra time, so I just pressed on ahead and eventually finished it without them. Sorry to be the one to say it, but Funky Shop is really here for players who aren't good at the game, for kids, and for people like me who don't want a bunch of footage of me making mistakes because it's less footage I have to record. To be fair, the levels are the first thing anyone thinks about when it comes to platformers. But let's just not kid ourselves by saying the overworld isn't lacking when there is the clear absence of an interlinking theme and a macro level challenge. And this counterpoint to say that the gameplay is king, that's what matters, is true. But as the original arcade Donkey Kong showed us, story provides a subtle but important motivator. Diddy's Conquest does not have a deep story. It's a simple rescue mission. But the flavor of the context is a swashbuckling pirate extraction behind enemy lines. At best, we could say Tropical Freeze is about homeland liberation, but it doesn't feel much like a journey. If the Kongs had a boat they took from island to island, that could be a small but meaningful step in selling us this idea. Tropical Freeze is more about vacation island escapism instead, and for that goal, it's satisfactory. But personally, it's a lot less compelling because it allows the player to be passive and indifferent to the stakes. There is mounting tension in DKC2, especially when you begin the final ascent, climbing K. Rool's Keep, where the challenge is through the roof, and the music track Crook's March ignites a fire within you. That momentum outside of the individual stages is much ado about nothing in Tropical Freeze. Some platformers are about navigating obstacles, like Mario. Some are about exploration, like Metroid. And some are about momentum, like Sonic. And still others, like Castlevania, blend genres together such that platforming is merely one facet of its larger gameplay goals. In the case of the original Donkey Kong Country, the goal is about flow. You want to get into an organic, instinctive state where all you're doing is swinging from tree vines and barreling your way through the jungle. And Tropical Freeze has this, and it has it in spades. It is most noticeable when you have Cranky Kong as your companion. Jumping on his cane can launch you forward at a breakneck pace, and if you look online for the fastest speeds in the time trial mode, you'll note that he is frequently the Kong of choice. The trick with Cranky is that your momentum has to be fairly precise. If you are going a little too fast, too slow, or mistime a jump, it can become very difficult to avoid taking damage or to simply miss your target. This isn't a bad thing. If anything, it's a good thing because it means skill is involved and players who learn the enemy placement and stage layout can practice different approaches to moving quickly. But this is something that exists in the game even when you don't have Cranky with you. It's in the genetics of the game to have enemies and objects placed in such a way as to prompt opportunities for the player to get into that rhythmic flow. It took me some time to really consider what about this entry is different in a way that feels less good than the originals, but I think I have a decent guess. So in this game you have 2 hit points, but you can buy an extra heart for a 3rd hit point. Having a Kong buddy gives you an extra 2, and you can also drink banana juice, which provides invincibility for a short period of time. Compared with the original game, you have 1 hit. You can inflate this to 3 with your second Kong and an animal buddy, but more about animal companions later. I was originally going to argue that having all this health isn't necessary since the originals didn't need it, and all this really does is add unnecessary UI clutter, minimal as it is. But upon further reflection, I realized that I take a lot of hits in this game, and some of these levels are quite a bit longer than the originals. Don't get me wrong, I get hit in the originals too. I have to redo levels, I make mistakes, but I don't feel like I make them anywhere near as often. And neither of these approaches are bad, mind you, but I do wonder if the added health was there to counterbalance the way in which stages are presented to us. Think about it, our character sprites are much smaller than they were on Super Nintendo, and we're in widescreen to boot. There is a lot more information you can perceive at any given time, but also stricter hitboxes as a result. The hitboxes in Tropical Freeze are excellent, but the feel of the game is not a one-to-one comparison with the originals. In original Donkey Kong Country, everything is scrunched down into a small 4x3 box, and you have a good-sized sprite in the middle of it. So you end up just launching yourself forward, dealing with each crocodile as they present themselves. In going back and forth between games, you can really feel a burden being lifted when you pick up a Super Nintendo Donkey Kong. You fly through a stage, bouncing all over the place and hurling yourself at ape speed. And there are few games that can capture that freeing sensation so well, especially for the time. Tropical Freeze is very fun, but it is a different kind of fun. Whenever I encounter a new stage or one I'm not familiar with, there's a good chance I won't beat it in one try. I'm dying not because I don't know what's coming up, I'm dying because I need a particular kind of momentum, and as a cautious player, this spells death very often in the mid to late game. The level design is perfect. I have all the tools I need, but my response doesn't match what the game wants. I need to be in sync with the stage demands, and each attempt you learn a little more of what to be on the lookout for. But this is still a process of trial and error. Two good things I like about this. Firstly, it's refreshing to see a modern or relatively modern title embody an old school style of challenge. Learn what to expect and then just react accordingly. And secondly, I like that the game has some grit to it. Despite its more kid-friendly atmosphere, this is a tough game, but not one that will have you throwing your controller at the wall. Patience and practice always prevail in the end. But it's different in a way that is a little less relaxing. I can fire up original Donkey Kong and get into a groove in seconds. Your movement and reaction capabilities are far more immediate, and that suits the in-your-face limitations of the smaller aspect ratio and larger sprite work. Original DKC can't afford to have all these smooth animations and nuanced momentum. You have two speeds, walking or running, and that simplicity is a lot more palatable. When looking at Tropical Freeze, there's all this nuance in the animations that not only delay or complicate your actions, but they create gradation, a sort of speed sliding scale rather than a simple on-off switch. DK can walk, or creep, or stride. If you want to break into a run, there's this cartoonish windup. That's not an insult, it's just what it looks like. If you don't want that, you can roll, and if you're on the edge of a platform, you can roll off of it and jump. All of these things will take time to master. If you need to change directions during a jump, it's a slow process, which means you can't overshoot or undershoot or hesitate in any way, as there's no merciful recovery. Not that there should be, but this is just not how the originals play is all, especially as Diddy Kong. When speaking about DKC 2 specifically, there are very often moments where the player can pause to take a breath. The stages can sometimes feel like they are broken up into these short mini challenges linked together. While there are plenty of opportunities to do similarly in Tropical Freeze, the stage is still designed with that fluid, memorized execution in mind, so it doesn't feel the need to communicate so much when is a good opportunity for a pause. Instead, the player has to decide for themselves when they need a moment to catch up with the Kong family and to remember to take those moments. If you're interested in smelling the roses, you can always stop at a checkpoint or to do one of those mini games that spurt out a bunch of bananas, collect them all for a reward. These things are usually placed in safe environments, but sometimes the designers want to keep you on your toes, so they'll use it to bait you into danger. My point here is that while you can pause in these instances or others, the stage is better interpreted as one cohesive whole. In other words, I don't really like taking a pause in Tropical Freeze. It feels unintuitive to do so. I like the extended flow of play so much that taking that pause feels like I'm taking away from the good stuff that I enjoy about it, even if it technically isn't. I don't think Tropical Freeze made any kind of blunder with this, by the way. If anything, it does feel like a natural progression the series would have evolved into if Rare had been at the helm. If you want my opinion, well, I'm a purist, so I like my Donkey Kong challenging, but not the sort that causes too much frustration. And sometimes getting into a flow where you meet your mark consistently is a higher bar than I always prefer. You can easily get frustrated with either game. Platform games are not often for the faint of heart, but as much as I enjoy the ebb and flow Tropical Freeze presents, there are just too many instances where I take a chance to reach that next enemy, but get hit instead. I admit my reaction time, or lack thereof, is a factor in this, but I can still set sail through DKC 2. That is still a tough game, and I'm not going to do a perfect run when I pick it up, but I don't really get stuck on any one stage. Apart from animal antics. I do get stuck in Tropical Freeze on occasion because it's hard to gauge just how much momentum I have with how quickly I need to position myself for the next target. And if you're playing time trial or hard mode, you can expect mistake after mistake after mistake. This is the kind of stuff you experience in Super Meat Boy, except in that game, when you die, the level instantly resets, buffering the sting of defeat. And look at Rayman Legends, a game that has a lengthy loading screen to get in and out of a stage, something that only exists on the Switch version, by the way, and yet once you're in, it has near instant response. In Tropical Freeze, every time you die, you have to sit through a lengthy cutscene before you can try again. I initially thought this was from the fact that the game needed to reload the stage, but that's not the case, because you respawn not in the overworld, but at the beginning of the level or your most recent checkpoint, and I sincerely doubt we have that much to load. The respawn itself, in which we see Kong holding onto a balloon for dear life, is great, but why does it have to take so long? This complaint is not going to land if all you do is play the game on normal, by the way. But on time trial and hard mode, you're going to be dying a lot, and you'll be punishing yourself with each attempt, some of which will end after only a handful of seconds. Those respawns need to be skippable, or at least partially skippable. Dying and respawning also took longer in the originals, but they were ultimately shorter and they didn't have a time trial or hard mode. What's more is they had shorter stages on average, so the interruption is hardly noticeable. And yes, I do have a better mental map of those games. There is more emotional attachment there for sure. And maybe I just had more patience as a kid, but I do suspect that the originals have to be more careful because of that smaller screen. And it's not a slow-paced game at all. It is simply easier to land your jumps, intentionally or otherwise. In Tropical Freeze, there are quite a number of instances where I just barely miss my target, as well as times when I fly past my safety net and then realize that I can't make it as far as I was reaching, only to now realize that I can't get back to that safety net. I actually quite enjoy the tug-of-war the original games have, especially in DKC2. Certain stages are easier with a particular Kong, and if you end up taking a hit, it prompts a new challenge to manage the best you can until you can recover them. Tropical Freeze has its own version of old-school game design when you lose a Kong buddy after taking 2 hits. Oftentimes, old games would punish the player for performing poorly. Think Contra taking away your weapon when you get hit, for example. And here's a case where the originals were ahead of their time. Games like Doom and Dark Souls, and indeed the original Donkey Kong Country games, prompt a new, exciting challenge upon making a mistake, and that actually reinvigorates the game with fresh stakes. As the decades wore on, most designers simply defaulted to a fail-state scenario in which player failure meant going back to the most recent checkpoint. Over time, the checkpoints became gradually more generous, but the same principle applied to such a majority that it's hard to even recall the exceptions. Regardless of that, both games have a good spirit of playfulness to them, and each are uniquely challenging depending on your familiarity with the genre. The tag teaming of the Kongs in the originals was definitely a more original idea, but I don't think Tropical Freeze is wrong to have a more focused experience, though we have to admit it does create a limitation. If you feel like controlling DK is like controlling a big lumbering oaf, well, that's because it is. The one saving grace of DKC3 is that despite how awful Kiddy Kong is, you can basically play the whole game as Dixie if you prefer, which everyone does. Obviously, it sucks if only one of your characters plays well, but at least you have the better odds when there are 2 of them. DK doesn't control badly, but he does feel weighty and sluggish. Definitely not my style. I very much prefer Diddy and Dixie Kong, regardless of the game we're talking about, and I think it's easy to forget that sometimes having an extra option provides people with a way into the game. If Diddy is too fast, you can favor Dixie for a while, and vice versa. Now, you can technically choose your Kong in Tropical Freeze, but only in 2-player, which doesn't count because you need a second player, and also because someone still has to be Donkey Kong, though it is pretty fun to have that second player hop on DK's back. The other exception is hard mode. Hard mode I don't think is the greatest substitute because for one, you have to complete the entire game in order to unlock it, which there's no real reason to not get it immediately after completing a stage. There are far worse endgame rewards, but it is a design practice I think I would prefer see put to rest, and I'll tell you why. If, for example, you had played the game on Wii U and fancied a revisit on Switch, you'd have to play the entire game again in order to have access to a mode of a game you've already proven you can handle. If we really need to have something to document that we've beaten the game, on an easier difficulty, mind you, then we have achievements for that. Or we would if this was not Nintendo we were talking about. We could also just have cloud saves if this wasn't Nintendo we were talking about, but I digress. My playthrough of Metroid Prime Remastered was noticeably weak and less engaging because I had to beat the game again in order to earn hard mode, even though I've already beaten hard mode itself. My basic point is that after you beat a stage, you can play it in time trial mode. And I just don't see a strong reason for why we couldn't also play it in hard mode at that point. If I have to learn the stage or want to be sure that new players don't accidentally fall into it, then at least it only takes me a couple minutes to beat it. Unlocking hard mode is actually quite difficult since you need to complete each temple stage on all the islands, and they can get pretty hard even on standard difficulty. Though I will concede that I suspect most people would probably prefer to retrace their steps and play on hard mode only after they've gained a level of mastery with the game. But getting back to the Kong selection, my other point with that was just to say that locking the player's choice of Kong to a specific mode is a decision I understand intellectually, but it also radically changed my overall appreciation of the game. Why I have to go through an entire game just to get a chance to experience the mode I actually care about is beyond me. DKC 2 doesn't have a harder difficulty, but it does have a secret you unlock after you complete the game. And that secret would have been a better source of inspiration for Tropical Freeze, which of course is the discovery that the villain yet lives, and we get to confront him once more for the true ending. Even though Tropical Freeze doesn't give you a thematic win, it does give you an entirely new mode, and there's no complaining about the actual substance of the content in the game. In my most recent playthrough, I was surprised to see just how often animal companions were available in DKC 2. The animal friends provide an interesting way to proceed through the stage, and their inclusion makes a more dynamically changing title from a gameplay perspective. But I wouldn't say that Tropical Freeze fails in this regard. It has far fewer animal companions to be sure, but it makes up for it with the Kong companions. The Kongs are more similar in playstyle to one another than, say, Squid or the Spider, but they can be taken through any stage. Animal buddies are tied to approved stages only. I'm the kind of player that likes the pure Kong v stage action, so I don't really miss the animal companions too much. The inclusion of Rambi is a fun distraction, but I honestly kind of prefer not using him because it feels more like my skills are put to the test. It's kind of like playing Super Smash with a baseball bat. It doesn't automatically win you the match or anything, but it definitely homogenizes all characters on the roster and falling into a familiar format. Or at least that's how the Rhino functions. He's here to break up the usual fanfare with something bombastic. Given that this is a longer game, his inclusion is probably worth it. And I do think it's fair to say that not including On Guard was a real missed opportunity. If there was an animal companion who could have really added something fresh to this underwater extravaganza we're having, it would have been the swordfish for sure. This is a harder one to part and parcel. On the one hand, the animal buddies provided a clever way to give the player an extra hit point in addition to adding tons of variety to the gameplay experience overall. But Tropical Freeze has a slightly more dynamic starting roster of Kongs and at least 3 ways for which the levels can be played through such that it doesn't feel the impact of the missing companions too much. DKC 1 was all about flow, as I said before. Then DKC 2 came along and added exploration to that. And now in Tropical Freeze, we have the obligatory flow and explore mode, but we also have time trial and hard mode that build on top of those. Time trial heavily favors Cranky Kong, as I said before, in many stages due to how fast he can pogo stick his way across terrain. The online component to share replays is also a nice feature that allows the player to pick up tips on how to increase their time. It is a very gamey mode to be sure, but I think the island getaway vibe of the theme suits it well. People on vacation get up to all sorts of nonsense, so being able to see the nonsense others are doing in the world of Tropical Freeze actually helps sell that impression. Unfortunately, I don't have the patience to show off any of my time trial runs, but you can see my ranking on many of the stages. I'm by no means competitive, but I can get par time if I really apply myself. My favorite mode did end up being that hard mode though. This gives you just 1 hit point, no checkpoints, and no Kong companions. The trade-off is you get to select any Kong you like. I tried messing around with Cranky, but his unwieldiness caused me to die much too often. I launch myself across the screen like a rocket and then have a really hard time recovering bad situations. I tried Diddy a little, but his abilities are just inferior to Dixie in every way. I'm sure someone in the comments will explain what I'm missing here. For me, Dixie was the dudette of choice. Small, nimble, much faster than her earlier incarnations, and with a revised ponytail twirl that actually gives her airborne velocity. not only can she buy you time to reposition yourself to recover from those bad situations, but she can also cheat her way onto hard-to-reach platforms. Overall, I like the new iteration. I particularly appreciate how they incorporated her signature ponytail into a variety of actions, such as turning her hair into a propeller while underwater, and being able to hand slap, or should I say hair slap. If I had to complain, and it's me, so of course I have to, I do miss how she used to hold onto items. In DKC2, she would collect objects with her hair, and that was useful because while you're holding an item, you have defense from enemies and projectiles depending on the position of the barrel or the box that you're holding. You can see in this fight where Diddy has a harder time hitting the boss from above, but for Dixie, she has the advantage. In Tropical Freeze, she holds items in front of her like Diddy and Cranky, when it'd be more interesting if she held it above her head like before. Of course, if she's holding it with her hair, she can't use her ponytail twister power, but that seems like a fair trade-off to me. It's not a huge issue, as holding and throwing objects isn't quite as frequent in Tropical Freeze, but just something I noticed. That aside, the characters are depicted well, with Dixie being that real standout. A fun thing I did notice about Cranky Kong, though, was that his projectile attack is to throw dentures, and if you know anything about the character, you know he's a lovable grandpa in every sense of the word. So Retro Studios has a very playful understanding of the characters, I would say. But getting back to hard mode, the thing I love about this mode so much is that it strikes the sweet spot for what I love so much about this game. My original position was that DKC2 was the better game because I like its theme and its ebb and flow better. By that I mean I like the exploration mechanics in DKC2 and I don't find them distracting. In Tropical Freeze, I don't care nearly as much about the burst of bananas you have to collect, those little mini games you have to do. Because for me, that halts the game flow in its tracks, but you have to do it because there could be a puzzle piece there. But I get where the developers were coming from. It's a way to encourage the player to slow down so they don't ram their heads against the wall in frustration. If you're going into this game full steam ahead from the word go, you're going to be dying pretty often. Taking those few moments to recollect yourself helps buffer that. But I also wasn't much of a fan of minigames in all their forms in this entry, to be honest. The time trial mode is fun, but not something I'm a diehard for, but you crank up the difficulty until there are no distractions beyond getting the Kong letters, and once I realized this, I found myself getting into a style of play that was at once fast and aggressive, but selectively cautious. In time trial, sometimes it's just worth it to take a hit and keep going, but in hard mode, you can't afford that luxury. This is how I like it. It's Kong v obstacle, and I don't want to be slowed down with lightweight minigames or stressed about the time. I suppose my ideal game would double down on this, cutting the fat and with a few concessions, such as maybe an extra Kong for a buffer. Not that I mind the added challenge, but I wasn't exactly looking for a Super Meat Boy level of difficulty. And I don't think I would support that kind of game if it were to wear the Donkey Kong Country brand anyways. So for what it's worth, my appreciation of Tropical Freeze was greatly improved by having a mode that I personally synergized with better than the others. And I think that's the secret weapon of Tropical Freeze. There's something for everyone, whether you liked the originals or not. Regardless, it's probably best that we get back to the fundamental gameplay since that's what you'll be spending the majority of your time on. Funnily enough, the original Donkey Kong Country really didn't have meaningful exploration in that your rewards were basically just extra bananas and therefore more lives. When DKC2 came along, it infused a handful of collectibles that were common for platformers of the time, and that trend exists to this day. If you want to argue that DKC Returns should have taken a back-to-basics approach and done away with its collectibles in favor of total ambient jungle immersion in lieu of the original Donkey Kong Country, well, then you'll have my support. That's probably what Returns should have done, but I see that mostly as a missed opportunity, and I also wouldn't really expect that from Tropical Freeze. I mean, sure, I could die on the hill of what DKC was originally about, but I just don't find the collectibles to be a bothersome distraction, so I don't mind seeing them in the game. How they are implemented, though, is where things get interesting. DKC2 really did deliver a great collectathon experience. Finishing the game was one thing, but revisiting the stages to look for secrets added an extra layer to that. When merged with the unique visuals and fast and frantic gameplay of Donkey Kong Country, it made for a truly stellar platforming experience that has, at least in part, served to keep DKC2 relevant for so many years. Probably the best secrets to find are the Creme coins, of which there are around 1 to 3 per stage, and can be cashed in at Clubbas, the tough SOB of a merchant. Acquiring these coins means beating a minigame, all of which are unique for every token in the game, and when you pay the toll, you gain access to an entirely new stage in what is called the Lost World. These stages are much harder than the average and often come with a kind of gameplay mechanic that showcases how much creativity and challenge the developers were capable of. You also want to hunt down the DK coin, a singular, huge token tucked away somewhere in each stage. These tokens don't have a minigame, which is good because their worth is in finding them, not fighting for them. And when you get them, they're a huge imposing token that solidifies a victory for the player. You can even see the DK token symbol at the end of the stage title on the map screen, along with an exclamation point if you found all the other secrets. Collecting these tokens factors into the end game in which you are ranked with other Nintendo characters, a sort of meta joke referencing arcade score systems from the time. Now let's compare with Tropical Freeze. In this game, the Creme coins and DK coin have been combined into a single collectible, that being the aforementioned puzzle pieces. On the whole, there can be as many as 9 puzzle pieces per stage or as few as 5, but still, that's a good bit more on average. While it's not exact data, the stages are noticeably longer, so the larger number of secrets better accommodates the scale of the level design. On average, it took me about an hour to clear one world in Tropical Freeze, whereas in DKC2, I got through the first 2 worlds in the same amount of time. So the number is good. I also like how they depict the puzzle pieces in this rich honey color. Collectibles should be an attractive token. Gold or gold adjacent is always a winner. But I'm also less keen on how the bonus stages have been implemented this time around. All bonus rooms take place in this same generic treasure room and repeat the same 3-ish games with slight modifications. And further still, the objective is always the same. Just grab all the bananas. I now remind you that in DKC2, the minigames by and large reflected the stage you were in, and had unique objectives from defeat all the baddies to find the token or collect all the stars, etc. And while some objectives may as well have been interchangeable, it at least convinces you of its novelty, whereas Tropical Freeze shoots that down from the first bonus room you enter and never recovers. What do you get when you have all these puzzle pieces? Concept art for the game. So you mean to tell me I'm supposed to be incentivized to hunt down these puzzle pieces, which itself is weird because I doubt any ape would be interested in a puzzle piece instead of, a shiny banana-colored token, and all I get is the chance to further remove myself from the immersion of the game's world? What the hell? So yes, they colored the puzzle pieces correctly, but why does it matter to the Kongs in-world? In DKC2, those Creme coins unlocked more game content, and not just any game content, highly challenging levels, which needed to be completed in order to access the secret final boss and the secret ending. That's right. Like a monster in an old horror movie, K. Rool comes back for a round of revenge. Evil always finds a way to crawl back to life and scheme itself into mischief once again. The feeling you get is that there's always something more to the world. And it was all explained in-world. It was crocodile treasure, Kremlin booty, and you could pay a Kremlin defector to get access to their secret hideout. It was pirate-rich and helped the immersion factor. There's also this element of second chances going on. In DKC2, if you fail to satisfy the objective for the token, you can jump back into the bonus barrel and try again, assuming you can still reach it, that is. Well, in Tropical Freeze, if you slip up, you can't retry without attempting the entire stage from scratch. Curiously, if you collect a puzzle piece, that will remain collected if you can finish the stage. You can get the puzzle piece and then die as many times as needed until you either finish the stage or forfeit, abandoning all your collectibles in the process. For some puzzle pieces, it's a matter of finding them, so under these circumstances, I can kind of see how it makes sense. Why make the player go through the trouble of recollecting something when they obviously know where it is? But other times you have to grab a piece quickly, and if you fail to do so, it could spell certain doom for that attempted run. This holds true for the Kong letters, so I guess the purpose is to create different types of collectible challenges? In DKC2, if you collect anything that is scored or purposeful beyond the stage itself, it is a permanent acquisition, even if you exit out of the level. You have to have beaten the stage in order to have this option, of course, but it's there to save you time from having to complete the stage a second time. The Kong letters only grant an extra life, so they are firmly optional. The flexibility encourages the player to revisit stages for the purpose of finding all the secrets. What purpose is there in making the player replay an entire stage in Tropical Freeze just to have another attempt at the one bonus stage they missed? Obviously, I can beat the stage, and obviously, I can beat the minigame since I've already beaten the minigame because they recycle. I'm not going to act like every minigame in DKC2 was some kind of masterpiece of game design, but they were at least thematic, and more importantly, they were short. The Tropical Freeze bonus rooms are not bad. They provide a simple platforming distraction, and it would be fair to prefer them over DKC2 for whatever personal reasons you might have. But if we're going to have them at all, I'd rather they be short and personalized than vaguely challenging and repetitive. Now, to be fair, Tropical Freeze has secret exits in one or two of the stages to each world. These do unlock new levels to play through, and if you can complete all the stages in the area, it will unlock a final Banana Temple stage, which are significantly harder than the rest of the game, as I mentioned. I really like these bonus unlocks that showcase what the designers are capable of, and they're a hell of a rush when you finally complete them. You even have time trial mode and an unlockable hard mode that enables you to play through the game as any Kong you like, as I mentioned. So, again, there's plenty of good stuff here, but it is all very gamey. And therein, Tropical Freeze takes its stance as a great game, irrespective of how much it'll be remembered for artistic significance. The in-world justifications for discoverable tokens and unlocking secret stages may not matter to you, but it matters to me. These things would not matter if I was reviewing Super Meat Boy, but I also just probably wouldn't ever review Super Meat Boy. It's great gameplay, but its theme is too bare bones and cartoonish to even bother mentioning. And if I'm going to take the time out to review a game, it's going to have to be one that appeals to my sensibilities. And if gameplay is all that matters in the title, then it'll be much harder to cultivate my investment. And I'm not alone in this. There are plenty of reasons beyond hardcore gaming that people have for playing games, and Donkey Kong Country is no exception to that rule. And when it came to Donkey Kong Country, I would argue that a big, if understated reason is how enrapturing the world was to be in. As I close out my thoughts on the gameplay topics, it's a fitting time to discuss the boss battles. For the most part, both games handle this well. The original Donkey Kong Country has pretty weak boss fights if we're being honest, but that isn't true of either of these. And as you can probably guess, Tropical Freeze has longer, more challenging, and more controlled boss fights than the scrappy style of DKC2. There are two exceptions, however. The first is that DKC2 has a couple of very pathetic bosses in the early game, which I suppose is forgivable, but I think Tropical Freeze handles that a little better. And the other is that the final boss of each game is definitely different. The final fight with King K. Rool begins at the top of his castle. You muster up all the lives and all the courage you can before taking a deep breath and taking the plunge. When you enter, you find not K. Rool, but a captured Donkey Kong instead. He is hoisted out of sight, prompting the discovery of a new area, the Flying Croc. The face-off itself boils down to a simple but very lengthy combat exchange, handled entirely through jumping, of course. It's a flat nothing burger of a stage, and I don't mean that it's an ugly stage, it's a cool thematic one, I just mean that it's one platform, that's it. But that works in its favor, because it allows K. Rool to dictate the terms of the fight and keep the focus entirely on the exchange between the two of you. After he's defeated, we have to hunt him down in the Lost World in order to finish him off for good. And when it ends, we get this epic cinematic of the Kongs reunited, having gone to hell and back. The Kremlin homeworld sinks into the ocean. A little excessive on the Retaliation Force Kongs, don't you think? And we see a lone ship sailing away, signaling that this is not the end. I praise Tropical Freeze for having a simple and effective opening cutscene, but the send-off just barely lives up to the low expectations the opening set. The final boss room has a cutscene to introduce it, just like the other bosses, and then that's it. No twists or turns. And that's real fine, but it doesn't really make much of a villain, does it? He's content to be a mustache twirler from his throne and wait for us to get over there and kick his ass. Once you do, we get a cutscene where DK takes possession of the horn and blows a bunch of flowers that the Kongs slide down? Yeah, I don't know what to tell you here. It's fine. It's aggressively acceptable. Speaking of personal preferences, I also have to say that I do prefer the original trilogy much better when it comes to music. The music for the original Donkey Kong Country games are a mixture of ambient tropical jazz, and their notoriety in the gaming world needs no introduction. I will try not to belabor this point more than necessary. All three games really do an excellent job of crafting music that elevate and accentuate the biome that you're in. You can hear lava bubbling in the background on lava stages, water echoing in caves, and fireworks and screams of exhilaration during theme park rides. The music in the newer titles can largely be boiled down to remixes of the good old days. There are some new pieces, and I personally felt that Metroid composer Kenji Yamamoto ended up doing a fine job with Donkey Kong Country Returns, to be honest. Nevertheless, there's too much nostalgia baiting for me. It seemed especially noticeable in Tropical Freeze. The remix of aquatic ambience in an above water level in Donkey Kong Country Returns and Lockjaw's Saga in Tropical Freeze don't really inspire reverence. I'm more wondering why we have to recycle these pieces yet again. It's not about whether or not the remix is good, it is good. The problem is that it has the license to rip itself off, and doesn't bother to capture the intentionality of the original. The intro to Lockjaw's Saga, for example, has this sloshing, splashing rhythm, which is done to help communicate the idea of being in the hull of a pirate ship. This made it as much an aspect of the sound design as the music. And this was DKC2, a game whose follow-up was brimming with new pieces to help elevate the themes of the new title. Nowadays, all there is the greatest hits covers. Let's just take the overworld music as an example. That all too familiar piano theme in the original Donkey Kong was replaced with the much darker and more sinister heroism we heard in DKC2, aptly titled Welcome to Crocodile Isle. course, Crocodile Isle is here to reflect that feeling of being away from home in a dangerous land. But in Returns and Tropical Freeze, all we get is the same map melody from 1994. And why? Because nostalgia is more important than creativity. If the setting of the game took us somewhere more original, it would necessitate a more interesting, innovative score. Changing the setting also creates a driving force for the vibe or overall energy of the title, and that's something that DKC2 took a chance with and utilized it to its advantage. I would have liked to see Tropical Freeze do something similar. Now, I'm not saying I hate the map theme, and yes, this is a small point in isolation, but on the larger project vision, this is the third game to utilize the same song and the third version of aquatic ambience. This is my problem with newer Nintendo releases more broadly. They're either like Breath of the Wild, where they deviate so much that we're not even talking about the same series anymore, or they play it so safe that there's so little justification to exist. I'm also really not a fan of the accordion. I find that instrument kind of insufferable, to be honest, and he uses it a lot in Tropical Freeze. Actually, the accordion was a noticeable instrument in Breath of the Wild as well, though mercifully to a much lesser degree. But credit where credit is due, this is David Wise, the king of swing we're talking about here, and there are some great original pieces. Or if they aren't original, they're masked very well such that I didn't notice what he was referencing. My favorite piece in Tropical Freeze is unquestionably Scorch and Torch. Here's a cool bonus moment for you. We can see DK's hut in the opening backdrop of the first stage of the final world, along with the Snowmad ship resting at the island's summit. The music swells with intensity, and here we find one of those subtle but great moments I wish there were more of. I also freaking love Funky's Flying By. He's got the kind of tropical getaway beat that makes you linger in the shop even when you've done all your shopping. And there are a handful of other great tracks, many of which I have in the background of this video, but they aren't as concerned with communicating the environment. Instead, that duty falls more heavily on the shoulders of the art team. The art in the new DK games is too much in line with modern crispness, doesn't do enough to distinguish itself. I remember when Donkey Kong Country had some guts, where ambience was king and there was a fearlessness when it came to letting the imagination dictate the sort of world we traverse through. Now we've sucked the life right out of it, and all we're left with is this very safe, very inoffensive, very complacent visual style that's more child-friendly, which is really ironic since the originals were made specifically for kids. In the 1990s, video games were seen as toys, namely for young boys. Nowadays, the typical gamer is a far more amorphous individual, let's say, so you would think now should be the time to make something with more universal appeal or just something really daring that stands out. Social media rules the entertainment world now, and you don't dare do something that might cause a stir. In all fairness, the art style has its own charming innocence, and it communicates the island vacation aesthetic well, but that doesn't make it better. I want to see Kremlin pirates, crocodile predators with elongated jaws and gnarled teeth. I want to climb the mast of ships or minecart through a haunted house or crawl through a honey-drenched hive. DKC2 was spooky, and that small but noticeable underlining of fear was one of the ways the game kept the player on their toes. I wouldn't have been anywhere near as interested in Donkey Kong Country if not for those elements. Even areas that were less overtly scary had a very pronounced immersive element to them. You were surrounded with hot boiling lava, you were swimming in the wreckage of a sunken ship in the dark, climbing around the prickly spines of overgrown vines, sticking to honey in a giant hive. And what these locations all had in common was that they made you feel small. Monkeys can't fit inside a honey hive, but in this game they are made to because it transports you into an unconscious space, like something out of a dream. Donkey Kong Country is all about connecting with our primal roots, return to a... Unlike other platformers of the time whose very premise is beyond fathomability, Donkey Kong Country actually had only minimal requirements for suspending your disbelief. You are an ape in a jungle trying to protect your food reserves, and that's about it. The Kremlins are a representation of industrial colonialism in the first game, and pirates in the second, but these human layers are more for the benefit of the player than the characters in the world. The Kongs are protecting their homeland from an invasive species, protecting their food, their friends, highly simple but important stakes all the same. And all of it acutely appropriate for the subject of the animal kingdom and the narrow style of gameplay. Platformers are not, by nature, well equipped for thoughtful storytelling, but they can make up for this through enriching gameplay. It should feel like getting so enraptured with the world that you can't stop playing, can't look away, and instead you're running on pure instinct. It's all about tapping into those instincts and getting into the flow of the jungle. Because of course, instinct is how animals behave, and as mammals ourselves, we cannot deny our own needs to hunt, eat, sleep, procreate, you name it. That claustrophobic space was not arbitrary. It reminds us of when we were very small and enshrined in our mother's womb. You can even see young bees trapped in the hive watching us. Honey drips down the screen. It's total submersion. And the closest the new games come to this are the underwater stages, oftentimes ruined with goofy-looking sharks that really belong in Monsters, Inc. Even comparing the One Honey stage in Tropical Freeze clearly depicts what I'm talking about here. Beehive Brawl is not an ugly-looking stage by any means, but it doesn't stick with me. There comes a point when you make something so polished that it begins to lack a human touch. While I agree that the music and visuals support the theme of Tropical Freeze, it's the choice of theme itself that feels too breezy. It doesn't need to be another swashbuckling adventure, but you gotta give me something here. Like, if we're really doing an island getaway, why not have a volcano-themed area? Or how about riffing on the idea of being stranded on a deserted island with raft levels and palm trees stages? There is a little bit of this, but then other elements distract. We're remixing songs and you get it. Or better yet, how about just more originality in general? This stage here, done in silhouette, is absolutely awesome. They did this trick in Returns, and I remember my sister and I had our minds blown when it turned up. It was the last thing we expected, for the art style to suddenly screw the rules and present something truly fresh. There's 2 other stages that are done in this style, a well-chosen underwater level and an obligatory snow stage. But imagine if there was at least one stage in each world that really took a chance for something visually striking. There is so much more that the art could have done, but is frustratingly safe. It's so safe, I nearly forgot to add this bit into the script because I had already forgotten about them. DKC2 may have had less obligations to live up to, but it still took a chance in setting its game in a darker environment and switching up the main Kong for a new character. Those decisions could have easily upset fans, as we saw with Donkey Kong Country 3, but they committed to the vision and we got something that most consider the superior game in every way. Tropical Freeze is a more fully realized game than Returns, there's no question about that. But some of these improvements are really just things that should have been there from the beginning. I said before that underwater levels were something the team wished they could have done with Returns but weren't able to. And that comment has always struck me as very odd. A more recent example of this happening was when Paper Mario The Thousand Year Door Remastered launched and it was revealed to be in 30 FPS instead of 60 as it was in the original GameCube version. And the developers explained how it was causing problems for them to keep pushing for 60 frames, such that it was hurting other design objectives they wanted to hit. This wasn't a huge issue for me. As long as I get at least a solid 30, I'm typically content, although I've not quite played the remastered version yet. But nevertheless, it did spark an important question. Why exactly was it so difficult to get those underwater stages on hardware that was vastly superior in power to the Super Nintendo? It should have been on the design objectives from the very beginning. I mean, if your goal is to nostalgia bait us with aquatic ambience and, the whole enchilada, then you'd have to know that an underwater stage is a necessary component to that. A lot of people seem to push back on this kind of criticism under the banner of, but game design is hard, or, well, they had a time constraint. But these are excuses. Maybe they were understaffed, or maybe they had a harsh time constraint. And maybe the blame is on them, or the publisher, or an accident where some code got deleted. We can be understanding to the real humans behind the project, but my analysis is not on the working conditions of the developers. It's on the end results. And I find it interesting how novelists and filmmakers get far less grace than game designers. We're perfectly content to say a novel or a movie was crap, dismissing and ignoring the mountain load of challenges that go into those projects. Yet game designers can't be held to the standards that time and time again, games like Elden Ring and Baldur's Gate 3 and now Clair Obscura prove over and over. It's not even about length or depth, but simply the vision and how well the project lands that vision. You're always going to have challenges, and while we may never know who is to blame for why something fails to reach the expectations it sets out for itself, nothing changes what the player determines to be their experience from it. That's just the nature of engaging with a piece of art. At the end of the day, Donkey Kong Country Returns does not have underwater levels, and that is a very noticeable absence that does impact the overall experience for the player, irrespective of the reason for its absence. And from the sound of things, the team behind Returns already agree with me on this point, or else they may not have made Tropical Freeze in the first place. It's great Retros sought to correct this, and I absolutely believe Tropical Freeze to be a vastly superior entry in every way to Returns, but we gotta call a spade a spade. There are a few miscellaneous items that I didn't have a nice transition to, so I'm going to include them here. For Tropical Freeze, I haven't mentioned the on-rail stages when you're riding a rocket. I didn't mention them before because they're very quickly an afterthought. They're generally pretty easy and they don't overstay their welcome. If I was being cynical, I'd rather them cut for traditional minecart stages or something else entirely. The gameplay in these segments could really exist in any game. There's no leveraging of either the Donkey Kong gameplay style or aesthetics that justify their presence. They feel like a bonus stage most of the time and not a very deep one. But like I said, the bulk of the game experience is good, so I'm not going to die on this hill. I will say though that the music is annoying and one of the many earworm tracks in the score. Never has a game score been stuck in my head for literally weeks after playing it and weeks after editing it. I just cannot wait for this to be done. Another thing I wanted to address was the absence of the Kremlins, more specifically. Tropical Freeze has a new enemy faction, the Nomadic Penguins, with a Viking aesthetic. This is a huge step up from the Tiki enemies in Returns, who were very forgettable, but it's still a step down from the Kremlins in my view. And if your counter to this point is, but the Kremlins are growing tiresome, then you'll have to move to the back of the line. As far as anyone is concerned, the Kremlins haven't been in a Donkey Kong Country game since 1996, and not in a main Donkey Kong game since 1999, as far as I recollect. At least not one with a heavy emphasis on platforming and exploration like the Country games do, so I hardly feel like they've been overused. A lot of the enemies are now cute round things, and it adds to the lightweight attitude modern platformers placate to nowadays. Platformers used to be what we now define as AAA titles, and that meant they did not cater to a niche audience so much. And if you look at the top-selling games of the 1990s, you'll see Super Mario World at number 3, second only to Pokemon games. And then we have Lemmings, God only knows why, and then Sonic the Hedgehog, and then Street Fighter 2. Both Donkey Kong Country and its sequel are in the top 30, which is pretty wild when you factor in the release of the Nintendo 64 and the PlayStation consoles that permeate the latter half of the decade. I think DKC2 made a valiant effort to differentiate itself from platformers of the time. One of the most interesting moments is when you beat the game and see how many DK coins you collected. Mario and Yoshi are your top competitors, but if you look in the background, you can see Sonic's shoes and Earthworm Jim's blaster on the floor. I'd imagine they had to handle this carefully to avoid copyright infringement, but nowadays I do see this as a moment where Rare, just like they had done with the original Donkey Kong Country with Donkey Kong's redesign, were once again proving their worth. It's also a jab at Sega, as the two companies were at war at the time. But Donkey Kong Country deviated quite significantly from what Miyamoto and the higher-ups at Nintendo wanted. It was a game that gave DK a brand new look, heavily inspired by Rare's earlier Battletoads characters. It does come across to me that Rare very much took ownership over their games back in the day. Even though it was using Nintendo's characters and was being commissioned by Nintendo, they made sure to leave their mark. And like Rare itself, DKC2 left its own mark as a result. Its darker, moodier, edgier atmosphere is at once a synthesis of 90s hip culture as much as it is a culmination of platforming experimentation. For me, Diddy's Kong Quest is the richest platformer experience that has withstood the test of time better than the rest. Like I said in my Metroid Dread commentary, Dread isn't a bad game, but it isn't afforded the freedom to make industry waves, and that sentiment also applies to Tropical Freeze. Tropical Freeze is a faithful, nuanced, and excellently executed revitalization of the series, but it isn't a game to be remembered. If that makes the comparison unfair from the word go, then perhaps that merely highlights the changes in cultural preferences. There is something to be said for Retro Studios' ability to translate a game of yesteryear into a profoundly new and innovative experience that is equal parts true to form yet dangerously fresh at once. That game does exist, but its name is Metroid Prime. Prime doesn't just switch the perspective into first person. It recognizes that in doing so, certain sensibilities will be dramatically different as a result. The game will be slower paced, the game will need stronger narrative underpinnings, and so on. And Prime addresses those new concerns with confidence and genuine inspiration. This isn't to say that Donkey Kong Country Returns and Tropical Freeze are inferior, but rather that the Kong equivalent of what Prime accomplished would have been a very different game. What about expanding levels into a kind of interconnected world? How about doubling down on those silhouette stages and pushing the mood and atmosphere into an artistic extravaganza? There were ways to make this experience truly unforgettable, but that does not appear to be the design goal. The goal, like it was for Metroid Dread, was to resuscitate the lifeblood of a long-running series for new and returning fans. But we should really be fans of experiences rather than series or brands. This is partly why From Software games have become so successful. They understand that to call Elden Ring Dark Souls 4 is to put expectations on their own shoulders to adhere to, for the sake of history. So instead, they lean on their strengths and experiment and refine with each iteration. Obviously, too much experimentation is going to incur risk of alienation. This was my problem with Breath of the Wild. It deviated so much from the expectations that the game was unrecognizable as a Zelda title for me. But even so, I did at least respect it for daring to try, and I was hopeful that a balance could be struck in future Zelda titles. I very much doubt that will ever happen now, but that's beside the point. DKC2 may not have been as groundbreaking as Ocarina of Time or Super Metroid, but it remains a highly significant and exceptional title, and to have withstood the test of time as perhaps the most pristine execution among them is something that does leave a mark in the scores of history. By contrast, Tropical Freeze plays into its own era. For better or worse, it is a modern title that subscribes to the same choices many game series comebacks adhere to. They ask the question, what is the first thing you think about when you remember Donkey Kong Country? The answer is platforming, as it should be, but this can also skew the focus of the game design goals into maximizing the value of that one element at the expense of others, creating an assembly line of aspects that did have a meaningful, if nuanced, impact. Interesting NPC dialogue to break up the monotony? Gone. Atmospheric and immersive areas? Gone. A thematic structure to link together the world into a cohesive finale? Gone. None of those things are needed if all you're trying to do is make a great platformer. But I would argue those elements, sparse and seemingly insignificant as they are, collectively achieve something greater than the sum of their parts. There was also the path of going back to the roots of the first Donkey Kong Country, maximize flow and jungle vibes. The temple stages reveal that Retro does know how to place enemy platforms at the perfect spot. I could see a DK game with this style of rhythm at the front as a game that's hard to ignore. I'm not saying that every game needs to be like Cuphead, but talk about a game that made itself impossible to be ignored. So which of these two games is the best? Well, it depends. If theme is important to you, nothing can beat the moody, subconscious atmosphere of haunted forests, sunken pirate ships, crystal caves, bramble, honey, theme park rides. And DKC2 has all the great gameplay and level design chops the series is known for. But Tropical Freeze is objectively more game. What you sacrifice in aesthetics is compensated handsomely with a larger scale, endlessly surprising gameplay, a greater variety of modes, and a platformer that deserves to, and may yet still, stand among the greats, only time will tell. You're getting what you pay for, even if why you had to pay so much for it was a bit dubious. DKC2 has a historical advantage though, in that it's the best of the era of its kind. In 2014, Tropical Freeze launched on a horribly selling game console in what's now a niche genre, and in a market that is overflowing with competition. 4 years later, it solidifies a slightly larger audience and maintains critical praise, but not quite acclaim. No one says that Tropical Freeze is going to win Best Pixel at the Oscarinas, let alone be nominated. But you know what game was nominated for Best Pixel at the Oscars? Ooh, have I said too much? Sorry, shameless plug for my other channel that you should definitely check out because I won't be posting another video for a while due to some major life changes happening in my personal life. I also have another channel called The Homefront where I review movies, which you might want to look into as well. But yeah, big life events happening, so I'm glad I got this video made when I did, but probably don't expect anything new for the foreseeable future. But getting back to this video, DKC2 isn't the greatest game ever, I'm not going to make that claim, but it is the best Donkey Kong Country game. And for many, including myself, it is an essential game you owe it to yourself to play for how well it captures its genre, its time in gaming history, and for how well its emotional score and intoxicatingly rich presentation render it an unforgettable experience. And as for Tropical Freeze, when it fires on all cylinders, it's one hell of a ride. But if you'll permit me just one more pun, it did leave me maybe just a little bit cold.